Subscribe, turn on the bell, and tell yourself you're brave, because once you hear this, you won't sleep the same. They found the first body at 12:04 a.m., exactly when the church bell should have rung but didn't. The street was empty. No cars. No dogs barking. No wind through the elm trees lining Maine. Just the quiet, thick as a sheet over the town of Ashburn Falls. Detective Mara Collins arrived before the coroner. The victim lay in the middle of the crosswalk, hands crossed on his chest like someone had posed him. No bruises. No blood. A paper wristband, plain white, tied around his right wrist, the kind you get at county fairs. Except this one was stamped with 3 letters in faded ink, MR. Midnight Ritual. They'd called the night an unscheduled blackout, but the grid logs didn't agree. Power had cut only on the old square, not the entire town. The camera at the pharmacy had gone dark at 11:58 p.m., then flickered back at 12:07 a.m. Between those minutes, a man had been moved, placed, and left like a warning. The victim, 32-year-old Ethan Reed, wasn't a resident. He was a freelancer from Chicago, here to photograph the town's century-old mill for a Forgotten America series. He checked into a roadside motel 8 hours earlier and told the clerk he wanted to shoot after dark when the square is empty. Deputy Janelle Ortiz found Ethan's phone in the alley beside the library. The last video file was corrupted, a blocky smear of pixels that resolved into a single frame. A pale hand pressing over the lens, then black. On the audio you could hear 6 clock ticks, then a whisper so soft that Tech had to lift it. Quiet hours. Not a threat. A rule. Ashburn Falls looked like a postcard. 3 diners, a barber, 2 antique shops, a courthouse topped with a clean white cupola. People waved from pickups and the sheriff said all the right things. We're cooperating fully. Nothing like this happens here. But even he avoided the clock face mounted above City Hall. It didn't strike the hour. It didn't move at all. The hands were painted at 12. Mara drove the square, slow, and every third storefront had black paint faintly smeared along the inside of its window frames, as if someone had sealed them at some point and then hurriedly scrubbed them clean. She asked the pastor if a vigil had been held. He swallowed, smiled, and said, "Our town keeps its grief private." She asked the mill foreman whether the siren had blown that night. He said the siren hadn't worked in years. The maintenance logs said it had been serviced last month. At dusk, a woman in a nurse's uniform found Mara behind the courthouse and forced a folded note into her hand. "I didn't give you this," the nurse said, eyes shining with fear. Inside was a list of dates. Every entry was on a Thursday. Every entry read, Mr. 12 to 12:15, silent. Beneath the list, a second, smaller set of names with a single repeated initial beside each. S for sheriff. CH for city hall. ED for electric department. Mara and Ortiz went back to the square at 11:40 p.m., parked without headlights and watched. At 11:58, the old street lamps dimmed in a wave, like someone pinching out candles one by one. At 11:59, the courthouse cupola lit from within, a sickly yellowed glow that didn't belong to any municipal bulb. At exactly midnight, the building exhaled steam from a grate near ground level, and a door at the rear clicked, just once. They slipped around the hedges, past the bronze soldier's statue, and found the door, iron, unmarked, and locked with a fresh padlock whose keyway was still oily. "City records don't show this," Ortiz whispered, checking the blueprint printouts. She tapped the hinge as if knocking on a secret. The grate trembled with a low, rhythmic hum. From behind the door, the quiet wasn't empty anymore. It was a practiced, held-breath silence, a silence performed. Mara slid the nurse's note into her pocket and raised the bolt cutter. When they cut the lock and pulled the door, the breath behind it moved like people shifting in a crowded room, and what they saw at the top of the stairs changed everything. The air that poured from behind the door was damp and cold, carrying the smell of limestone and old metal. The narrow stairway descended in a spiral, its walls glistening with condensation. Detective Mara Collins held her flashlight tight, the beam trembling slightly across faded symbols etched into the concrete. Circles, triangles, letters, each one painted over at some point but bleeding through the new layer like a scar trying to heal. Deputy Ortiz followed close behind. "What the hell is this place?" she whispered. "Something no one wanted us to find," Mara said. At the bottom of the stairs was a corridor lined with storage rooms, each door identical, rusted steel with slits near the top. The kind of architecture built for keeping people in, not things out. One door stood ajar. Inside, on a single table, were dozens of white wristbands, each marked MR, stacked neatly like hospital tags waiting for their owners. Beside them lay an open ledger, its pages brittle and yellowed. The handwriting was precise and dated decades back. Attendance confirmed. 12 at midnight. Ortiz flipped through more pages. The same phrase repeated every Thursday for almost 40 years. And at the end, in fresher ink, the entries had changed. Offerings completed. Silence maintained. The sound came then, soft footsteps from deeper in the hall. Both women froze. A figure appeared in the beam of Mara's flashlight, a man in a dark maintenance uniform, face gray with dust. He blinked at them, expression blank, then lifted his hand slowly, not in surrender but in warning. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "They'll hear you." "Who will?" Mara asked. He turned his head toward the far end of the tunnel. "The council. They meet when the clock stops." Before she could press further, a deep bell tone vibrated through the concrete, one single, slow chime. Midnight. The man flinched, dropped the wrench he was holding and bolted down a side passage. Ortiz gave chase, but when she turned the corner, the hallway was empty. They followed the sound of the bell until they reached a heavy wooden door marked utility access. But what lay beyond wasn't utilities, it was a room large enough to fit a courtroom, lit by a dozen flickering candles placed in a perfect circle. In the center stood a wooden chair, bolted to the floor, surrounded by chalk outlines that looked hastily erased. And on the wall behind it, in paint darker than rust, someone had written, "Keep the town asleep." Ortiz covered her mouth. "Jesus. They've been using this." "Recently," Mara said, pointing to a camera tripod tucked in the corner. The red record light blinked faintly. She pressed the stop button and pulled the SD card free. "Let's see what they don't want anyone to know." They retreated to the surface, the early dawn creeping across the courthouse steps. In her car, Mara connected the card to her laptop. The screen filled with darkness, then a circle of people, faces hidden behind old porcelain masks, standing around the same chair they had just seen. At first there was no sound. Then a man's voice, deep and steady, "For the protection of Ashburn Falls, one must bear the silence." A second voice, a woman's, spoke from behind the camera. "The outsider knows." He filmed the square. Mara's stomach tightened. The voice was familiar. She turned the volume up. The woman stepped briefly into frame, adjusting the candles. The porcelain mask tilted, catching the light, revealing the gold badge clipped to her belt. Sheriff's insignia. Ortiz leaned closer, eyes wide. "That's Sheriff Dunn." The video ended abruptly as the candles went out. Before they could react, both women froze at the sound of gravel crunching outside. A black sedan had parked across the street. Two men in suits stepped out, each carrying a file folder stamped with the Department of Justice seal. One approached the cruiser window and tapped twice. "Detective Collins?" he asked calmly. "We'll be taking that evidence. The town is under federal review now. You're both to leave immediately." Mara hesitated. "Who authorized this?" The man handed her a document without looking her in the eyes. The paper was blank except for a single red stamp across the top. "Confidential, Midnight Regulation." She looked up, but the sedan was already turning away, disappearing down Main Street just as the courthouse clock began to tick for the first time in years. And somewhere beneath the ground, a low hum started again, soft, steady, mechanical. "Tell me you heard that," Ortiz whispered. Mara nodded, gripping the SD card she'd secretly swapped before they arrived. "They can take the evidence," she said quietly. "But they won't take the truth." But neither of them knew, the real truth wasn't on that card. It was still recording deep below as the next name was added to the ledger. The morning after the federal agents took over, Ashburn Falls looked too normal. Kids walked to school. The bakery opened on time. Even the courthouse clock chimed again, something it hadn't done in decades. But to Detective Mara Collins, the sound wasn't comforting. It was a warning. Every tick echoed through her chest like the countdown to something she couldn't stop. She hadn't slept. The real SD card, the one she'd hidden in her coat lining, sat in her laptop now, playing on loop. She watched the masked figures again, counting them. Well, exactly 12. And then, near the end of the video, one figure broke the circle, pulling off their mask to whisper into another's ear. It was the town's mayor. The man who'd publicly offered her every resource just the day before. Ortiz arrived at her motel room, pale and shaken. The sheriff called. Said the case is closed, unrelated death, pending no foul play. They're burying it. Mara turned the laptop toward her. "Not if this gets out." The footage ended with the masked group chanting the same phrase over and over, "Keep the town asleep." Then, one by one, they placed their hands on the chair's armrests, as if renewing some ancient pact. Ortiz backed away from the screen. You think they're sacrificing people? Mara didn't answer. She rewound the clip. On the far wall, partly hidden by shadow, she noticed a number scrawled beneath the phrase. It wasn't random, it was coordinates. By noon, the two were driving along the narrow county road that led past the mill, following the coordinates into the dense pine woods. The map ended at an overgrown trailhead. Beyond it, the ground dipped into a clearing surrounded by rusted fencing and a half-collapsed shack. Inside the shack was a trapdoor. When Mara pulled it open, the air below was stale, heavy, like it hadn't moved in years. They climbed down. The flashlight beams swept across old machinery and shelves stacked with labeled jars, soil samples, each marked with a date. The same dates from the nurse's note. Thursdays. Every one of them. At the far end of the bunker was a steel locker. Inside were rows of black binders labeled community records. But the pages weren't census logs or property deeds. They were death certificates, each stamped decommissioned resident. The signatures matched those on the federal document from the night before. This isn't just a ritual, Mara said quietly. It's bookkeeping. Before Ortiz could respond, her radio crackled to life, static, then a voice whispering through the interference. Return to the station, detective. We need to talk. It was Sheriff Dunn. When they emerged from the woods, the sheriff's cruiser was already waiting. Dunn stood beside it, hands folded. You shouldn't have gone down there, she said softly. You've seen what keeps this town safe. Safe. Mara snapped. You're killing outsiders to hide whatever's under that courthouse. Dunn sighed. You think I like it? You think I started it? I inherited this just like everyone else who takes the badge here. The town doesn't belong to us, it belongs to them. Them who? Dunn looked toward the horizon. The founders. Their agreement still stands. Before Mara could press, Dunn raised her hand, and headlights appeared behind her. Dozens of cars rolling up, people stepping out quietly, faces unreadable. The same townsfolk who'd smiled at them in diners and waved from porches. Each wore a white wristband. Ortiz whispered, They're not even hiding anymore. Mara reached into her jacket pocket, clutching the spare SD card, the one she'd mailed to a news outlet hours earlier. You can keep your rituals, she said, but the world's going to know. Dunn's eyes softened. No, detective. It never does. The crowd moved forward. The air filled with the low hum they'd heard beneath the courthouse, the sound of old machinery stirring to life again. The ground vibrated. Lights flickered across the town square miles away. Then everything went silent. When the state police arrived 2 days later, Ashburn Falls was empty. No people, no cars, no trace of its 3,000 residents. Only the clock tower remained, frozen once more at midnight. Weeks later, a package arrived at a local news station in Chicago with no return address. Inside was a single SD card and a note written in shaky handwriting. They said the town must stay asleep. But someone has to stay awake. The footage on the card ran for exactly 12 minutes. The final frame showed the courthouse basement. Empty, except for a new ledger on the table. The last entry read, Collins, confirmed. 12 to 12:15. Silence maintained. If you think this story was intense, the narrator's voice fades in, you're not ready for the next one. Hit subscribe before the next clock strikes 12.